All right, so this by no means works all the time because some exercises, like say you're about to do a barbell squat, well, your first movement is going to require eccentrics, letting you go down, then making you come up. Or a bench press, you take it off. The first contraction is actually going to be eccentric. But I think it's the majority of machines. Again, there are some exceptions, but a majority of machines, the first initial movement is going to be concentric because you got to make the plates pull away from go away from each other and let them come back to each other, right? So I thought of this last night when I was trying to think of other ways to explain this, is that we should have a very comfortable understanding that in this start position, how do we know it started? Because all the plates are together, that he is twisted to his left, right? So if you think about it, we did this with stretching. If he's twisted to his left, he's lengthening muscles that would want to pull him to the right. If he's twisted to the left, there's pretty much no more motion he could do that way. So the fact that he's twisted to his left kind of infers, oh, I'm about to activate right transverse because his position is twisted to the left. So using left muscles, there would be no road to go that way. He's lengthening rights and bringing the right hip to the left ribs. Does that make sense? So maybe for some of you, you might be able to see it better by identifying the position and then saying, oh, well, which muscles, because of that position, which ones are being lengthened? Because those are the ones I'm probably going to need to contract on that initial concentric to bring the 2 points closer together. Maybe it worked for you, maybe it does. And it's just a different way to look at it. All right, let's get to the hips. Ooh, big class, big class. Who graduated from a big school, like a 5A school? How many people in your school, roughly? How many did you graduate with?
My graduate class, we're wow.
Wow. That's not how many people's in my whole town.
I got back on there.
350, 400. So that's a big class, right? So sometimes with those big classes, it's hard to remember who sits in the front, who sits in the back, right side, left side. But the concepts are still there. That's why we worked into this. We started off with a super small class, right? I only gave you 4 muscles. Then we branched off a little bit bigger class, and now we're getting into a much bigger class. A few things to note, though, with the muscles of the hip. It's a big class for a couple of reasons. It's a big class because it takes a lot of muscles. Remember, we progressed. It doesn't really take a lot of muscles to influence my cervical. It's not a lot of stuff there to move around. It takes more muscles to influence my trunk. Makes sense. I got more stuff here. But when you get down to the hips, you're influencing more stuff. So it makes sense. You're going to need more muscles. The other thing is, in addition to mobility, our bodies utilize a lot of strong hip muscles for stability. Very, very important. And the trade-off between stability and mobility is range of motion. So we won't get the same range of motions in our hips that we do in our shoulders. However, we don't suffer near the catastrophic dislocations and subluxations that we do in our shoulder. We gain mobility up here in our bullet socket at the detriment of stability. Guys, if you dislocate your shoulder, you can still run away from danger. If you dislocate your hip, you better hope you have somebody who's got your back. See what I'm trying to say? So we put a lot of security into maintaining our hip stability as well as our mobility, not necessarily range of motion. So this is it. These are all the muscles. It's a lot. These are the muscles you're going to be required to learn. Here is just the outright list. If you're a list person, have at it. And here is the class circle. So guys, all of this, all these words is literally visually put into that. It's the same thing, just written out differently. One's a visual and one is a literal. Couple points of emphasis. This is the first of our appendicular, and it's going to be the rest of them. You only have one cervical. So right and left literally means to the right and to the left. When we get to the appendages, arms and legs, my right literally means my right leg, my left leg. Okay. So in other words, we only needed one circle for the cervical. We only needed one circle for the trunk. But now technically we would need two circles, right? For the right hip and the left hip. Lucky for us, we don't have to. We don't have to. All we need to do is do one circle. And since the majority of us are right-handed, we're going to do a right-sided circle. Reason is, you have the same muscles on your right hip that you do your left hip. Same muscles. And it's a mirror effect. You know, in 310, I talk about the mirror effect. So in other words, if we tried to do two circles, it would be extra confusing because the left side is really the medial side. And the right side is really the lateral side. So if we drew two circles, they would not look like each other. They would be mirrors of each other. The medial would be closest to the medial. The lateral would be further away from the lateral. So we're only going to learn the muscles from the right-sided perspective, but that's okay. If I'm doing left hip stuff, you identify the agonist of the muscles of your left hip. So let's say I do this, and you're like, oh, that's my left hip extensors. Well, guess what? The extensors on the right side are the same muscles as the one on the left side. Does that make sense? So when you're identifying the agonist, I need my left hip flexors. You can still go to your right-sided circle and say, who are my flexors? Because the right flexors are the same muscles as the left flexors. This is just a tool to make sure we account for all the different things. Does that make sense? Okay. The second thing is, you're going to see, for the first time, muscles that sit the fence. Y'all have heard that term before. When you're sitting the fence, it means you can't really make a choice. You don't know whether to go this side or that side. You're kind of in the middle. So think about it. Muscles that are on the axis that sit the fence, they are neither lateral nor medial, only posterior. Muscles that sit this fence are neither posterior nor anterior, they're just lateral. Muscles that sit this fence are neither posterior nor anterior, they're just medial. And muscles that sit the fence at the top are neither lateral nor medial, they're just anterior. A muscle like the pectineus or the tensor fasciolata, that would be examples of muscles we've had before that are anterolateral or anteromedial, or right sterno is in the front and the right side. But now, for the first time, we're going to have certain muscles that sit fences. And the reason is stability. Being able to have muscles that cross right on the axis. Very good for joint stability, encapsulating that joint to make sure we don't have a problem. A quick reminder from Group 10, your body puts a lot of effort into maintaining hip stability. Because again, if you dislocate your hip, that is a bad, bad day at the office. Now we can make it work. They have prosthetics and orthotics and stuff, but our ancestors, if you had a dislocated hip, so our body puts a lot of stock in security of stability here. You have a deep socket. You have a ligament inside there called the teres ligament. You have these big Y ligaments that encapsulate, and then you have these big, powerful muscles that, again, not just for mobility, but for stability. You put a lot of effort. Dr. Bob Macklin, the ortho at Auburn, who I did my fellowship with, he was like, dislocate your hip, you either have some kind of unknown pathology, some necrotic stuff, or, old people fall and hurt their hip a lot because their bones are starting to get brittle. But he's like, that's like car crash stuff, like very, very high traumatic events, like to do that, okay? So that's why we have a lot of muscles. We got to move our body, we got to do explosive motions, and we also have to protect while we do it. Okay? The other unique thing about the hip are these guys. You notice they're in a circle, and that circle is sitting both fences. It's sitting the anterior, posterior axis and the bilateral axis. Meaning that these are like, y'all heard of the rotator cuff in the shoulder? These are like rotator cuffish of the hip. They are muscles that neither sit anterior, posterior, so no flexion extension, neither medial nor lateral, no ab or ad. However, they live to spin the merry-go-round. Their favorite is playing on the merry-go-round, so that's why they only have this arrow as external rotators. Gemellus superior, gemellus inferior, obturator, internus obturator, externus quadratus femoris, the flags. And like the seven bore, I guess doc would be the piriformis. Can anybody name the seven dwarfs? Does anybody know the seven dwarfs from the movie, from the cartoon? So. Snow White, yeah, and her posse. Who was in her posse? The reason I wanted it is because there's one that like at 8:30 in the morning, everybody's sleepy. Yes, that was the one that I was trying to get to. Sleepy, happy, grumpy, dopey, sneezy, bashful, and dog. All right. Shut up, Campbell, and give us our money's worth. This hip is a right hip that would literally look like this. Anterior crossing muscles are going to pull in the direction of hip flexion. Posterior crossing muscles are going to pull in the direction of hip extension. Lateral crossing muscles are going to pull in the direction of ab. Medial crossing muscles are going to pull in the direction of ad. Because this is a right circle, muscles that are trying to spin the right merry-go-round this way are going to be internal rotation pulling muscles, and lateral or external rotation pulling muscles. Do you see how it at least is set up? Flexors are going to be pectineus, rectus femoris, sartorius, iliopsoas, tensor fasciae lata. Just as an example. Guys, we're going to go through these. I'm just trying to break down how the circle works. Okay? Lateral crossing muscles, piriformis, gluteus medius, menis, tensor fasciae lata, gluteus maximus, semimembranosus, semitendinosus, biceps femoris, long head, gracilis. And then finally, we have muscles that have pull in their name. Thank you, adductor family. Adductor magnus, longus brevis. Thank you. Actually having the direction of pull in the name. Mwah. Wish they would all do that. Any questions before we get going? Let's do it. Let's start with the anterior compartment, or the muscles that are going to be crossing the hip in the front. So again, the function of a muscle, origins, insertions, it's how does it cross? Ironically enough, the first muscle we're going to talk about, the iliopsoas, starts in the back because it has origins on the lumbar vertebra, inserts in the back on this. See that blue knob right there called the greater trochanter? So it starts in the back and it ends in the back. But it crosses the hip in the front. So that's why it pulls the hip anterior. That's why it's a hip flexor. So if all we did was memorize origins and insertions, the functions may not be there. We have to understand how these muscles cross to get to where they start and where they finish, right? So the first muscle we're going to talk about is the iliopsoas. The iliopsoas is a common name of two separate muscles that blend into one. It's like peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Now you got peanut butter, you got jelly, but it's really one thing, PB&J. So you have this muscle called the iliacus, which you remember you have an ilium of your pelvis, right? The seashell, that's your pelvis. So you have, see this red part right here? So you have the iliacus, and then you have sections of the psoas, and they come in and they blend. It's like merging onto the interstate. You get like two different roads, and cars from each road can blend in to the new road. It's the same concept. You have two separate muscles that are going to blend in and form one big rope that's going to cross the hip anteriorly, reach back and pull on that greater trochanter back here. But it doesn't matter that it inserts posterior. The fact that it crosses in the front means that it's going to pull in the front. Does that make sense? So our first muscle of the hip, the iliopsoas. There's the iliacus, there's the psoas major and minor, blending into one common tendon. Now, here's another problem with photos that have a bunch of, I know you guys are tech savvy. You ever seen the tech anatomy where you can take away layers, right? Like you can click and it takes away layers, right? So sometimes these old photos have everything all at once and things are more superficial or deep. Like this sartorius is very superficial, so it kind of hides what's happening with the iliopsoas. So we're going to get that out of there. And let's find, oh, I see what I did. I see what I did. There she is. Yoink. So look, once we get all of the wrapping off of the package, we get all those other muscles out there. Now we can just look at the package itself. So we have the iliacus, the psoas, they're coming in together, merging onto the same interstate, crossing the hip anteriorly, and then inserting in that lesser trochanter more posterior. So again, muscles can only pull. To me, the easiest way to see this is just literally visualize. You grab onto that string and you say, what direction of motion would it pull in? Be a flexion pull. It makes sense. Now, y'all remember from levers, if the muscle inserts close to the axis, it gives it an advantage of speed, right? So look how close, like it crosses the hip and then it's inserting on that tubercle, on that lesser trochanter, very close to the hip. So this would be one of those muscles that if you're sprinting, it would help you create fast flexion, right? Because you're trying to flex as fast as you can. Does that make sense? So this would have a mechanical advantage of fast flexion, fast hip flexion. I'm not going to skip around. I think what I did is I wanted to show you guys all the muscles as they are to talk about the confusion. How in the world can you see everything when they're all perfect? It's like a busy intersection at a bit in Houston where there's roads coming in and out all over the place. And so, and I think I was like, all right, well, we do it by isolating each muscle so that we can see how each muscle pulls. So here's a posterior compartment showing you all the stuff happening. And then we're going to do it, we're going to isolate. So the iliopsoas would be here. And notice I go redundant. I abbreviated here so that way if you're like, what's IPS? And it's It's my abbreviation. That doesn't mean you can't have a different abbreviation, but it's just, we don't want to write. If we wrote all these Latin terms, we wouldn't have a lot of room inside of our circles. Does that make sense? Like if we wrote it out, which you can, that's what works best for you, just make your circle big, if you could write out the specific names of the muscles, that's fine too. But the only reason I abbreviate is to make it practical. And ESPN does this all the time, like they may not spell out New Orleans Saints, they just may put, same concept. Does that make sense? All right, let's get to we're just gonna go down the line instead of hop around. So we have these posterior rotator cuff muscles of the hip. This is a posterior view, so this is from the back. And again, muscles can only pull. So if you just look at the right side, and you see how these muscles are crossing into the femur, wouldn't they have a lateral or external pull? Especially the ones that are not the piriformis, all of these muscles are almost all X. There's no obliquity to it. There's no angle. Does that make sense? So lateral rotators of our hip, also stabilizing, protecting that femur from translating laterally, trying to keep that femoral head in. Okay. Guys, I wish some of these names would be like Jimmy, Sally, Bobby, but they have Latin origins, so you got to get gemellus, the gemelli, inferior, superior, obturator, internus, externus. This one I kind of like, quadratus femoris. It's a square-shaped muscle on the femur. 6 lateral rotators, and then the famous piriformis. I know y'all all heard of it. It's a celebrity. Piriformis looks different, huh? Like piriformis, like apple, banana, strawberry, sledgehammer, that piriformis has some angle to it. Make sense? So all the others are very horizontal. And then that piriformis is at an angle. It's on an incline. So the piriformis crosses the hip laterally. So in other words, the piriformis has a external rotation pull, but it also has a lateral pull. Think of it as a posterior deltoid, which is something y'all might be familiar with, where it's in the back, but it still pulls laterally. Just trying to give you an analogy of something you might be familiar with. So in anatomical position, the piriformis is a hip abductor and a hip lateral or external rotator. The reason the piriformis is so famous is because your sciatic nerve, let's see if I have it, we'll go through these all when you get to it, but I think I have it, there it is. So your sciatic nerve passes from your ilium, your lumbar, they merge into an interstate and they pass. Now, this is what's really cool. They've done a ton of cadaver studies where they look at anatomical differences in large numbers. Some people's sciatic nerve in these studies was deep to the piriformis, meaning the nerve was on the inside of the muscle. Some, it was on the outside. And some, it actually went through the muscle itself. Pretty cool. And so when you have a tight or contractured piriformis and you have that electrical plumbing happening right there, it can mess with your signals. Okay. The last thing I'll say about the piriformis, all of our muscles, in terms of pull, are based off of anatomical position. However, there are some muscles that can switch function depending on your joint position. I'll give you a practical example and then I'll try to explain it with the terms. Your pec major, when you're below 90 degrees, it's an adduction pull, trying to bring your humerus to your thorax. But when you go past 90 degrees, it switches function. It's still trying to pull your humerus to your thorax, but now it would be an abduction pull. Just an example. I hinted at this for the trunk. In anatomical, the rectus abdominis is just run straight. It's not trying to pull me across. However, if I'm twisted to the right, it would want to pull me back to the left. And if I'm twisted to the left, it would want to pull me back to the right. Does that make sense? So here's what I'm going to show you. I think this is really cool. Those of you that work in the clinics, you'll do a piriformis stretch. Try to stretch it out, sag nerve. But if you notice, you want to get the person flexed and rotated. But the piriformis in anatomical is a lateral rotator. What motion, what hip rotation is this? This isn't internal rotation. This is external rotation, right? So how am I stretching a muscle that is an external rotator by externally rotating? And the answer is because you switch its function as you flex the hip. I'm going to explain it. In anatomical position, the piriformis kind of runs something like this. Adductor, external rotator. But notice the angle of my fingers. When I flex my hip at the same degree, well, now that muscle is not trying to rotate me. All it's trying to do is abduct me. It no longer has any spin. And if I keep flexing, now that muscle is actually trying to internally rotate me. So therefore, externally rotating is concerned. It's pretty cool. Well, it's an abductor. So if you add the deduct, you can, right? So if you flex, external rotate, and adduct, you can get it a little more. You get a little more. Yeah. So because it would be an you'd want to make sure you add the. Right? All of our functions, save for, I think I'll hold you accountable to brachioradialis and the pec, but all of our muscles in terms of their functions are going to be based off of anatomical position. Most of our muscles, 95% of our muscles only pull one way regardless of the range of motion. But we do have some muscles that can switch function, and it's a brilliant strategy because it gives us extra help in certain positions where we need it. It's kind of cool. All right, so let's look at these lateral rotators one at a time. And remember, guys, can you imagine if I tried to say, all right, in 3 months, I need you to memorize origin, insertion, its function, the nerve innervation, the blood supply. Some people do that. But if I did that, I would only have time to give you stuff to memorize. And I'm not about that life. I'm trying to get us to apply. I'm trying to get us analytically thinking. How long it took us to figure out some of that trunk stuff, right? Like that takes time. And if I want to know the origin of Keanu Reeves, I'll just ask Google. Google will tell me where he's from. And Google will tell me where Frank Sinatra's buried. Origin, insertion, innervation, that doesn't change. But being able to apply this stuff, that's the true gift. That's the stuff you can't necessarily just look up. The operator, yeah. Yeah, but it's not as It's definitely not as,
Like the thing about that, her thighs muscle. And their, and that is.
the internus. No, because if you think about, first of all, it's a great question. Some of the tightest muscles we have in our body are tight because they get used a lot, right? They get recruited a lot, they get innervated a lot. So for my track people, distance people, there's a muscle called the tensor fascia lata that's chronically tight, IT band syndrome. That muscle is a flexor, abductor, and internal rotator, meaning it gets recruited like it has 3 chances to get recruited, sometimes in multiples. So when we look at our lateral rotators who only lateral rotate, in addition, you have the big gluteus maximus, who's a lateral rotator. The other lateral rotators, by default, don't get recruited very often. They don't get innervated very often. Stability, making sure we don't have lateral translation of the femur. But in terms of recruitment, the more we recruit a muscle, it makes sense that the more tone it's going to have, the tighter it's going to be. So then you look at something like the piriformis, who is recruited every time you weight bear because it's an abductor. So you're going to be recruiting it to abduct. So it gets recruited with the others as external rotators, but on top of that, it gets recruited every time you need abductors. So it gets recruited a heck of a lot more. And then in addition, on top of that is your activities of daily living, or for a lot of people, activities of daily sitting, activities of daily compression, riding, biking, trucking, compressing those structures into each other, in addition to the natural extra tone. So in terms of like, if somebody has a bad sitting posture, I can see how that compression might be able to alter where it is, but in terms of the muscle being tight naturally because of innervation reasons, usually the 6 little lateral rotators aren't tight because of recruitment, because they only get recruited when you need external rotators, whereas the piriformis gets recruited when you need external rotators and abductors, and you need abductors every step you take. Oh, no, 100%. It's a catch-all fraction. No, 100%. Well, and that's why you need to do follow-up testing. That's why it's important eventually to be able to palpate, right? To be able to know where it's at so that you can touch some origin, touch some insertion. So origin insertion doesn't have no use. But remember, I have a student group that has a lot of different variable interests. And the one thing everybody's going to have in common is how do muscles function, right? So 100%. You know what it's like? It's like shin splints. Like it's a catch-all term. You could have medial tibial stress syndrome. You could have periosteitis. You could have tendonitis. You could have tenosynovitis. So you could have all these different things, but it's just easier to say shin splints. Absolutely. All right, so obturator internus. Guys, all I'm asking you to see is this is a posterior view. Can you see how it pulls in a direction of lateral rotation? And can you see how it'd be very efficient for stability, right? Posterior stability. Obturator internus, obturator externus, gemellus superior, gemellus inferior. There's our square-shaped quadratus femoris, and then finally our parallel. What's a what? Oh, wow, what a great question. Typically, so the question was, can muscles become tight because of both overuse and non-use? two different mechanisms. So an example of a muscle getting really tight because of no use is what we try to never do anymore that we used to do in the old days, and that's sling. Like, the older generation didn't understand that when you sling, when you create immobility, that muscle's gonna atrophy. And the muscle will atrophy not only circumferentially, but longitudinally if it's in a slack position. That's why maybe not you guys age, but when you first get out of bed, your muscles are really tight. Because most people will end up in more of a fetal position, more in a flexed, slack position. Basically, your hips and your knees and your ankles and your elbows are in a sling for hours and hours and hours. If you get out of that sling, they're very tight. Because your body literally will eat itself up in length to create a new resting lift event. But by non-use, that's typically immobilization. And with the atrophy of the muscle comes the tightness as it shrinks itself, as it atrophies, it's going to create tension or tightness. So you imagine being in a sling for an extended period of time and then getting out of that sling, it'd be very tight. Right? You got to work at the range of motion. The kind of tightness we're talking about is really a combination of two things. One is you overwork, not overwork, but you recruit the muscle. That's what tone is. Like a bodybuilder may have very high resting tone, meaning that the muscles at rest are still pulling more than someone like me, right? But the biggest thing is lifestyle. Is when you're sitting in that chair, your hips are in a sling. When you're sitting on your sofa, your hips are in a sling. Think about it. Sling, extended period of time, not good. We know that. Sling, extended period of time, not good. We know that. But are you not going to flex your hips when you're driving? Are you not going to flex your hips when you're sitting? Are you not going to flex your hips when you're playing cards? You're not going to when you're doing homework? So and that's what's going to be really cool for some of you guys as therapists, athletic trainers, even coaches, is if somebody's really tight in certain places, it's not necessarily just because they've been working it a lot, it's that they've been in slings for a long period of time. So that's where it merges your 2 points. You can have tightness because of working it a lot, but then you can also have tightness because you have it in a sling and the body's going to eat up some of that length, create a resting tone. And the tightness you feel is the elastic properties being eaten away in series. I love having these conversations. All right, so we got our lateral rotators. All right, I promised you we were going to go that one. So look, here's the picture of the piriformis. Right, so it ran exactly how I taught you guys. Right, so again, an anatomical ab external puller. Okay. Now we're going to get into, I call the seashell muscle, the gluteus medius and minimus. Okay. The gluteus medius and minimus. Like for the chunk we talked about, like the obliques. Well, which ones? We got externals, we got internals. Sometimes they work together, sometimes they don't. Right external and right internal work together frontally. They work together sagittally, but they don't work together transversely, right? So I think that plays sometimes with the glutes. So we got gluteus maximus, we have gluteus medius, we have gluteus minimus. This is gluteus medius, and underneath it is minimus. Remember we talked about pulleys, how muscles that are deep could serve as a piggyback for muscle on top of it. This is an example. This is your first example of a concept called a fan-shaped muscle. And what does a fan-shaped muscle do? You already have experience with this. Your deltoid is a fan-shaped muscle. So your deltoid is one muscle, the deltoid, but it has an anterior portion, a middle portion, and a posterior. Those aren't three separate muscles. They're just, when you have a fan, your muscle can innervate. Y'all know what motor units are? Remember that for physiology? Motor units are the nerve and all the different fibers that it recruits. Motor units don't scatter to different parts of the muscle. They're very localized. So in other words, if all I recruit are the front fibers of my deltoid muscle, one muscle, well, those specific fibers, in addition to pulling laterally, also pull anteriorly and also spin medially. So you have portions of the fan. And when you have a fan-shaped muscle, look at upper pec, it's the same thing. It's a fan-shaped muscle. And you have certain fibers that might have different pulls than other fibers. But they will always have at least one thing in common since they're the same muscle. You ever looked at a trapezius muscle in a book and you're like, that muscle makes no sense whatsoever? I'm going to teach you how it makes sense because of the fan-shaped concept. Okay? So the gluteus medius and minimus. For the pelvis, I like to think of the pelvis as a broken seashell. So you have a full seashell, right? That goes pinky to thumb. For my pelvis, though, the posterior part of the shell is kind of broken. Like, in other words, it has a middle and it has a front. But the back is played by the sacroiliac by the sacrum. So you see this red right here? That's the piriformis. That would literally be like the posterior deltoid of the hip. So the shell has a middle and an anterior, but not necessarily a posterior part of the shell. Middle and an anterior. Okay? So all of the fibers of the gluteus medius and the gluteus minimus, medius on the outside, more superficial, minimus on the inside, more deep. Those are lateral crossing muscles. They cross on the outside. So what do you think they're going to pull in the direction of? Abduction. Now, the anterior fibers, this is where trigonometry is incredibly cool. Because it doesn't look like there's a lot there. But with trig, there doesn't need to be a lot there. There's more than you think. The anterior fibers of the gluteus medius and minimus are like the anterior fibers of the deltoid. They also pull laterally, or they're abduction pullers, but because they're in the front, not only do they have an upward pull, but they have a rotation pull. They are internal or medial hip rotators. Was that? Just the front fibers, just the anterior fibers. And again, that may sound like, what in the world? We do it all the time with the pec. We say upper pec, right? We say upper chest. We anterior deltoid. So we have precedent to use specific parts of the fan. This is not new. It may be a new example, but it's stuff I know you guys have heard before. If we can say anterior delt, we can say anterior gluteus medius and minimus. And again, it doesn't look like it's a lot, but because of trigonometry, it doesn't need to be a lot to have a big component of X pull, of internal rotation pull. So gluteus medius and minimus, let's go up to our descriptors. Gluteus medius and minimus, hip internal rotator, anterior fibers, just the front. Because if you think about it, guys, the middles, they're only pulling laterally. There's no obliquity to the middles. There's no obliquity to the ones that are just running straight up and down. That would be like rectus abdominis, external oblique. It runs at an angle, right? So the fibers that are just running up and down can't pull in a direction of spin. Only the angles that have spin pull can make you pull in a direction of spin. So in the written form, internus, externus, superior, inferior, square shaped femoral muscle, piriformis, external rotator and hip abductor, and then we are here, gluteus medius and minimus. Hip internal rotators, but only the anterior fibers have the obliquity to try to spin you. Again, guys, we have precedent. When you're doing incline, don't you emphasize the upper chest, right? The clavicular fibers. Very simple. The anterior fibers are the only fibers that have internal rotation pull. Now let's go to our circles. The circle gets a little fun. So far, and I'll wrap it up on this. You have gemellus superior, inferior, obturator externus, obturator internus, quadratus femoris. Sorry, obturator internus, externus, gemellus superior, inferior, quadratus femoris. All those muscles are trying to do is laterally rotate the hip. They sit the fence anteriorly or posteriorly, they sit the fence median and laterally. They're just there to play recess. Your piriformis crosses lateral abductor, and it's also trying to spin the merry-go-round laterally or externally. And then finally, the gluteus medius and minimus. Both muscles, lateral crossing, so they're abduction pullers. Now, this is where you need to make a note. Only the front fibers, only the anterior fibers have the obliquity to pull in a direction of internal rotation. The middle fibers are just running straight up and down. In other words, it's not true to say that all of the fibers of that muscle are internal rotators. Only the fibers that have the angle to do so. And again, we have precedent. If you've ever said the word posterior deltoid, there's your precedent. Because the anterior deltoid has a different rotation pull than the posterior. But yet they both have the same lateral pull. Any questions? If anybody, I have on my channel like 400 and some videos. So I have a ton of videos that go, that's what I love about what I teach. It doesn't change. The analogies change. And I think over time I get better at explaining things. But it's not like the research is going to come back and say, hey, remember that muscle that crossed in the front? It somehow pushes, I mean, it's the same stuff. So in other words, if you wanted to work ahead during the break, watch some videos that complete the circles, complete the muscles, just go to my channel, and they're all there if you want to get a head start, okay? All right, guys, you have a good day.